Welcome to an epic journey through time that will fundamentally change how you see the ancient world. Picture this. It's 539 BCE, and the greatest city on earth, Babylon, opens its gates without a fight to a Persian king who claims he's liberating, not conquering. This isn't just another tale of ancient warfare. This is the story of history's most remarkable empire, one that invented religious freedom, created the world's first declaration of human rights, and built a civilization so advanced that its innovations still shape our world today. The Persian Empire wasn't just vast, it was revolutionary. While other ancient powers ruled through fear and oppression, the Persians pioneered something entirely different. An empire built on tolerance, respect, and the radical idea that diverse peoples could thrive under one crown while keeping their own customs, gods, and traditions. But this is also a story of dramatic reversals, of mighty kings who could reshape the map with a single decision, and of an empire that survived for over a millennium through 3 distinct dynasties, facing down Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and countless others who sought to destroy it. From the windswept plains of Central Asia to the marble palaces of Persepolis, from the battlefields of Marathon to the last stand against the Arab conquest, this is the complete, unvarnished history of the Persian Empire, a story of power, innovation, tolerance, and ultimately, transformation. Chapter 1. The Rise of Cyrus the Great in the rugged mountains of Fars, in what is now southern Iran. A child is born around 600 BCE, whose destiny will reshape the ancient world. His name is Cyrus, and according to legend, his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, dreams that this boy will one day overthrow him. Like so many ancient tales, this one begins with a prophecy of doom and a desperate attempt to prevent it. The Medes control much of the Iranian plateau, ruling over various Persian tribes as vassals. Young Cyrus grows up in this world of mountain fortresses and tribal loyalties, learning the arts of war and diplomacy that will serve him well. But by 559 BCE, when Cyrus becomes king of the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, the ancient world has no idea that it's witnessing the rise of history's most transformative ruler. Cyrus doesn't merely rebel against his Median overlords. He revolutionizes the very concept of conquest. When he defeats his grandfather Astyages in 550 BCE and captures the Median capital of Ecbatana, something unprecedented happens. Instead of slaughtering the defeated army and enslaving the population, Cyrus incorporates Median nobles into his administration and respects their customs. This isn't weakness, it's genius. The new Persian strategy spreads like wildfire across the ancient world. Where other conquerors create resentment and rebellion, Cyrus creates loyalty. His army doesn't just grow through conscription. It grows through voluntary service as liberated peoples join his cause. The Persians develop a sophisticated understanding of human nature that their competitors lack entirely. But Cyrus's masterstroke comes in 547 BC, when he turns his attention westward to Lydia, ruled by the fabulously wealthy King Croesus. According to Herodotus, Croesus consults the oracle at Delphi about whether to attack the Persians. The oracle's response is cryptic. If you cross the river, you will destroy a great army. Croesus assumes this means Persian defeat, but the oracle, as always, speaks in riddles. The Battle of Thymbra becomes a masterclass in military innovation. Croesus fields the finest cavalry in the world, but Cyrus surprises everyone by placing camels in his front line. The horses, terrified by the unfamiliar scent and sight of camels, refuse to charge. Lydia's legendary cavalry becomes useless in a single stroke of tactical brilliance. When Croesus realizes he has indeed destroyed a great army, his own, it's too late. The conquest of Lydia brings Cyrus into contact with the Greek city-states of Ionia, beginning a relationship that will define centuries of world history. But rather than see these encounters as merely military, Cyrus approaches them as opportunities for learning. Persian administrators study Greek mathematics, Persian engineers adopt Greek architectural techniques, and Persian merchants establish trade networks that span continents. The growing empire faces its greatest test in 539 BCE when Cyrus marched against Babylon, the ancient world's most powerful city. Babylon's walls are so massive that chariots can race 4 abreast along their tops. Its hanging gardens are counted among the world's wonders. Its king, Nabonidus, commands armies that have dominated Mesopotamia for centuries. Yet when the Persian army approaches, something extraordinary occurs. The gates of Babylon open, and the city surrenders without a siege. How does this happen? Cyrus has spent months conducting what we might now call psychological warfare, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator sent by Marduk, Babylon's chief god, to restore proper religious observance. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in Babylon's ruins, records his promises: freed slaves, rebuilt temples, respect for local customs. This isn't mere propaganda. It's a governing philosophy that will sustain the Persian Empire for centuries. While other ancient rulers demand submission to their gods, Cyrus encourages subjects to worship their own deities more fervently. Cyrus's final campaign takes him northeast against the Massagetae, a nomadic people led by Queen Thamyris. Here, in 530 BCE, the great king meets his end. According to Herodotus, Thamyris defeats the Persian army, and finding Cyrus's body among the dead, fills a wineskin with blood and thrusts the dead king's head into it, declaring, "I warned you that I would quench your thirst for blood, and so I shall." But even in death, Cyrus transforms the world. His son Cambyses inherits not just an empire, but an idea that diverse peoples can be unified not through oppression, but through respect for their differences. The Persian model of tolerant imperialism will challenge Greek city-states, Egyptian pharaohs, and eventually the Roman Republic itself. The shepherd boy from Fars has become the template for all future empire builders, and his legacy will echo through Alexander the Great, Augustus Caesar, and beyond. Cambyses inherits the largest empire the world has ever seen. But inheriting greatness brings its own curse. How do you surpass a father who literally changed the rules of civilization? Cambyses chooses the most ambitious target imaginable: Egypt, the ancient world's oldest and most mysterious kingdom, protected by desert, defended by the Nile, and ruled by pharaohs who claimed to be living gods. Egypt in 525 BCE represents everything the Persian Empire is not. Where Persia embraces cultural diversity, Egypt has maintained the same religious and social systems for over 2 millennia. Where Persian kings rule through appointed governors, the pharaoh's authority flows directly from the gods. Where Persians adapt and absorb, Egyptians preserve and protect. The collision between these two worldviews will reshape both civilizations forever. Cambyses begins his preparation years before the invasion. Persian diplomats establish relationships with Arab tribes who control the desert routes to Egypt. Persian engineers study the Nile's flood patterns and the logistics of moving large armies across waterless terrain. Most cleverly, Cambyses exploits a civil war between Pharaoh Amasis and his son Psamtik III, timing his invasion to coincide with Egyptian political chaos. The Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE showcases Persian military innovation at its finest. Egyptian forces, commanded by the young Psamtik III, hold strong defensive positions at the entrance to the Nile Delta. There, strategy depends on traditional phalanx formations and superior knowledge of local terrain. But Cambyses employs psychological warfare that would make his father proud. According to later accounts, the Persians drive cats, ibises, and other animals sacred to the Egyptians before their battle lines. Egyptian soldiers, forbidden by religious law from harming these creatures, cannot effectively fight back. Whether this account is literally true matters less than what it reveals about Persian tactical thinking. They understand that defeating enemies requires defeating their beliefs, not just their armies. Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, falls after a brief siege. But Cambyses faces a more complex challenge than his father ever encountered. Egypt isn't simply a kingdom to be conquered. It is a civilization built on the idea that its pharaoh is literally divine. How do you rule people who believe their legitimate king is a god, especially when you just defeated and killed him? Cambyses' solution reveals both his brilliance and his limitations. He declares himself pharaoh, adopts Egyptian royal regalia, and participates in religious ceremonies honoring Egyptian gods. Persian administrators learn hieroglyphics and study Egyptian law. The conquest becomes an absorption, with Persians adapting to Egyptian ways as much as Egyptians adapt to Persian rule. But success breeds ambition, and ambition breeds mistakes. Cambyses launches expeditions south into Nubia and west toward the Oracle of Ammon in the Libyan desert. Both campaigns end in disaster. The Nubian expedition retreats after heavy losses to disease and desert warfare. The Western expedition simply disappears, 50,000 Persian soldiers vanishing into the Sahara without a trace, becoming one of history's great mysteries. Greek historians, particularly Herodotus, paint Cambyses as increasingly unstable during his Egyptian years. They describe him killing the sacred Apis bull, mocking Egyptian religious ceremonies, and executing nobles on whims. But Persian and Egyptian sources tell a different story, suggesting that Cambyses actually worked hard to respect Egyptian traditions while integrating the kingdom into his empire. The truth likely lies between these accounts. Ruling Egypt requires a delicate balance between maintaining Persian authority and respecting Egyptian sensibilities. Some of Cambyses' actions, seen as sacrilegious by Egyptian priests, might have been necessary administrative reforms. Others might reflect the genuine strain of governing a civilization fundamentally different from anything in Persian experience. The crisis comes in 522 BCE when news reaches Egypt that a pretender claiming to be Cambyses' brother Bardia has seized the Persian throne. Cambyses immediately begins the long march back to Persia, but he never reaches home. Near Mount Camel, the king dies mysteriously, some say from an infected wound, others from suicide, still others from assassination. With Cambyses' death, the Persian Empire faces its first succession crisis. The pretender Gamada, claiming to be Bardia, controls Persia's heartland and has begun reversing many of Cyrus's policies. Egyptian rebels prepare to restore native pharaonic rule. The empire that seemed invincible just months before suddenly teeters on the edge of collapse. But the Persian system proves more resilient than its enemies imagine. A group of Persian nobles, led by Darius, a distant relative of the royal family, organizes a conspiracy against Gamada. In September 522 BCE, they stormed the royal palace and killed a pretender. Darius emerges as the new king, but his real challenges are just beginning. The conquest of Egypt establishes a pattern that will define Persian imperial expansion for centuries. Each new province brings new administrative challenges, requiring Persians to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of governing diverse populations. The empire grows not just through military conquest, but through bureaucratic innovation, creating systems flexible enough to accommodate radically different societies while maintaining central authority. Cambyses' reign demonstrates both the possibilities and the limits of Persian expansion. His success in Egypt shows that the Persian model can work even in civilizations with strong indigenous traditions. His failures in Nubia and Libya reveal that even Persian military excellence has boundaries. Most importantly, his death crisis proves that the empire's survival depends not on any single ruler, but on the institutional structures and cultural values that Cyrus established and that future kings must continue to develop. Chapter 3. Darius the Great and the Perfect Empire. Picture the Persian Empire in 522 BCE as a vast house of cards, held together by the personal authority of its kings and the loyalty of its diverse peoples. When Darius seizes the throne by assassinating the pretender Gomada, he faces immediate rebellions across the empire. Babylon declares independence. Egypt prepares to expel Persian governors. Scythian tribes raid the northern frontiers. Media refuses to acknowledge the new king's authority. In less than a year, Darius must prove himself worthy of the crown that Cyrus the Great established and Cambyses expanded, or watch the world's greatest empire dissolve into chaos. What happens next transforms not just the Persian Empire, but the entire concept of imperial administration. Darius doesn't merely suppress rebellions, he reimagines how empires should function. Over the next 36 years, he will create administrative systems so sophisticated that they influence governance structures from ancient Rome to modern nation-states. The Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in western Iran, records Darius's version of his rise to power. Written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, it serves as both historical record and propaganda masterpiece. Darius presents himself as the rightful heir chosen by Ahura Mazda, the great god of truth, to restore order to the world. But beyond its religious language, the inscription reveals a ruler who understands that legitimacy comes not just from divine selection, but from effective governance. Darius's first innovation revolutionizes imperial communication. He establishes the Royal Road, a 2,500-kilometer highway stretching from Sardis in western Turkey to Susa in western Iran, with relay stations every 25 kilometers. Royal messengers can now traverse the empire in just 7 days, compared to the 3 months required for ordinary travelers. This network doesn't just speed up communication, it transforms the empire into a single administrative unit where the king's will can be implemented across vast distances almost instantaneously. But Darius' masterstroke lies in his solution to the fundamental problem of empire. How do you control distant provinces without destroying the local systems that make them productive? His answer is the satrap system, perhaps the most sophisticated administrative innovation of the ancient world. The empire is divided into 20 satrapies, each governed by a Persian noble who serves as the king's personal representative. But these satraps aren't mere military governors. They're expected to maintain local laws, respect religious customs, and encourage economic development. Each satrap is balanced by a separate military commander and a royal secretary who reports directly to the king. This system of checks and balances prevents any single official from accumulating too much power while ensuring that local knowledge informs imperial policy. Perhaps even more revolutionary is Darius's approach to imperial economics. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered territories, he creates the world's first integrated international economy. The famous Persian gold darak becomes the standard currency from India to Greece, facilitating trade across previously isolated regions. Each satrap is assigned a specific tribute obligation, but the assessment is based on the province's productive capacity, not arbitrary demands. Babylon, with its rich agricultural lands, pays 1,000 talents of silver annually. Egypt contributes grain to feed the royal court and army. India provides gold dust and exotic goods. This system encourages economic growth because provinces benefit from increased productivity through reduced per capita tax burdens. The results are spectacular. Trade flourishes as Persian peace eliminates banditry and warfare across the empire's major routes. Lydian merchants establish trading posts in Egyptian ports. Babylonian banking houses open branches in Scythian territories. Indian mathematicians and astronomers find patronage at Persian courts. The empire becomes not just a political unit, but an economic and cultural ecosystem that benefits all participants. Darius's building projects reflect this prosperity and reveal his understanding of imperial psychology. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital he constructs in Fars, isn't designed primarily for defense or administration, it's built to awe. The great audience hall can accommodate 10,000 people, while the walls display relief carvings showing representatives from every corner of the empire, bringing tribute to the Persian king. But these aren't scenes of subjugation. The carvings show delegations wearing their traditional dress, carrying their distinctive products, maintaining their cultural identity, while participating in a shared imperial ceremony. This is visual propaganda of the highest order, demonstrating that Persian rule enhances rather than eliminates cultural diversity. By 499 BCE, the Persian Empire seems to have achieved something unprecedented in human history: a stable, prosperous, multi-ethnic state that governs through consent rather than fear. But success breeds new challenges, and the greatest of these emerges from an unexpected source: the Greek city-states of Ionia. The Ionian Revolt begins as a relatively minor affair. Greek cities along the Anatolian coast, encouraged by promises of support from Athens and Eretria, declare independence from Persian rule. For most empires, this would be a simple matter of military suppression. But the Persian system's emphasis on local autonomy and cultural respect makes the situation more complex. Darius faces a dilemma that will define the remainder of his reign. Military action against the rebellious Greeks risks undermining the tolerant image that makes Persian rule acceptable to other subject peoples. But allowing successful rebellion invites challenges from every other province. His solution reveals both the strengths and limitations of Persian imperial strategy. The Persian response is methodical and overwhelming. Artaparnes, the satrap of Lydia, coordinates a systematic campaign that retakes each rebellious city. But rather than simply crushing the revolt, Persian forces work to address its underlying causes. Cities that surrender quickly have their privileges restored. Leaders who cooperate find positions in the new administration. Only the most obstinate rebels face severe punishment. The revolt suppression by 494 BCE seems to validate Persian methods, but it also reveals a fundamental weakness in the empire's relationship with Greek political culture. Unlike other Persian subjects, many Greeks view political independence as a prerequisite for civilized life. Their city-state system depends on citizen participation in government, making them inherently incompatible with imperial administration, no matter how benevolent. Darius' decision to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting the Ionian Revolt sets in motion the most famous military campaign in ancient history. In 490 BCE, a Persian expeditionary force, led by Artaparnes and Datis, sails across the Aegean, intending to demonstrate Persian power and deter future Greek interference in imperial affairs. The Battle of Marathon becomes one of history's great upsets, but its significance extends far beyond military tactics. When Miltiades leads the Athenian phalanx in a successful charge against Persian forces, he isn't just winning a battle, he's challenging the entire Persian model of inevitable expansion. For the first time since Cyrus began his conquests, Persian arms suffer a significant defeat. More importantly, Marathon demonstrates that the Persian Empire has reached the limits of its expansion model. Against enemies who share Persian values of cultural tolerance and economic cooperation, Persian methods prove irresistible. But against peoples who define their identity through opposition to imperial rule, Persian advantages disappear. The Greeks aren't fighting for better terms of submission. They're fighting for the right to remain independent. Darius spends his remaining years preparing a massive invasion of Greece proper, but he dies in 486 BCE before the campaign begins. His son Xerxes inherits not just the world's greatest empire, but also its first insoluble problem. How do you integrate peoples who define themselves through resistance to integration? The reign of Darius the Great represents the Persian Empire at its most successful. His administrative innovations create unprecedented prosperity and stability. His building projects showcase imperial grandeur without oppressing subject peoples. His economic policies generate wealth for conquerors and conquered alike. Yet his encounters with Greek independence movements also reveal the limits of even the most sophisticated imperial system. Some peoples, it seems, cannot be governed well. They can only be conquered or left alone. Chapter 4. Xerxes and the Greek Wars. When Xerxes ascended the Persian throne in 486 BCE, he inherited more than an empire. He inherited an obsession. His father Darius died while preparing the largest military expedition in human history, aimed at the seemingly insignificant Greek city-states that had dared to defy Persian power at Marathon. For any other king, the rational choice might be to write off the Greeks as a minor irritant and focus on more profitable conquests. But Xerxes is not any other king, and the Greeks represent something more dangerous than military defeat. They represent the possibility that Persian expansion has limits. The scale of Xerxes' preparations defies comprehension. According to Herodotus, the Persian army numbers 1,700,000 fighting men, supported by an equal number of auxiliaries and camp followers. The logistical challenges are staggering. Persian engineers spend 3 years building a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, connecting Asia to Europe with a structure so massive that 2 ships can pass side by side beneath it. Supply depots are established every few days' march along the route through Thrace and Macedonia. The Persian navy, drawn from Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian contingents, numbers over 1,200 warships, a fleet capable of controlling the entire eastern Mediterranean. But perhaps most revealing is Xerxes' psychological preparation for the campaign. Unlike his predecessors, who presented their conquests as liberation, Xerxes frames the Greek expedition as divine justice. The Greeks are rebels against the cosmic order, defying the will of Ahura Mazda as expressed through Persian rule. This isn't pragmatic imperialism, it's ideological warfare. The famous scene at the Hellespont where Xerxes orders his soldiers to whip the waters for destroying his first bridge illustrates the campaign's fundamental character. Where Cyrus and Darius understood that some obstacles require adaptation, Xerxes believes that sufficient force can overcome any resistance. He's about to discover that Greece will teach him otherwise. The Persian advance through northern Greece proceeds exactly as planned. City-states submit without resistance, offering earth and water as tokens of submission. The Greek alliance seems fragmented and ineffective, with many states choosing collaboration over hopeless resistance. By August 480 BCE, Persian forces approached Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass that represents the last natural barrier before the rich plains of central Greece. Here, King Leonidas of Sparta makes his stand with 300 Spartans and about 7,000 other Greek allies. The numbers seem ridiculous. How can such a small force delay, much less stop, the largest army in the world? But Leonidas understands something that Xerxes does not. Geography can multiply the value of disciplined troops, and morale can overcome material disadvantage. The 3-day battle at Thermopylae becomes the stuff of legend, but its real significance lies in what it reveals about the collision between Persian and Greek military cultures. Persian tactics depend on mass and coordination, huge formations of infantry supported by cavalry and archers, overwhelming enemies through sheer scale. Greek tactics emphasize individual excellence within collective discipline. Smaller units of heavily armed warriors who fight as unified entities. For 2 days, the Spartans demonstrate the effectiveness of their approach. Persian attacks shatter against the bronze wall of Greek shields and spears. The famous Persian archer boasts that their arrows will blot out the sun meets the Spartan response. Then we all fight in the shade. This isn't mere bravado. It reflects a fundamentally different attitude toward death and honor that Persian commanders struggle to comprehend. The battle's outcome is predetermined when Ephialtes, a local Greek, shows Persian forces a mountain path that allows them to surround the Greek position. Leonidas, recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, dismisses most of his allies but remains with his 300 Spartans and about 1,000 other Greeks to fight to the death. Their sacrifice buys precious time for Greek defensive preparations and, more importantly, transforms a military defeat into a propaganda victory. Persian casualties at Thermopylae are relatively light, but the psychological impact proves devastating. The image of the great kings as vast army being held up for 3 days by a handful of Greeks spreads throughout the Mediterranean world. Suddenly, Persian invincibility seems questionable. More dangerously for Xerxes, his own subjects begin to wonder whether resistance to Persian rule might be possible after all. The Persian advance continues successfully after Thermopylae. Athens evacuates its population to nearby islands rather than face a siege. Persian forces occupy the empty city and burn the Acropolis in revenge for the destruction of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. From a Persian perspective, the campaign seems to be achieving its objectives. Greek resistance is crumbling, and the enemy's most important city lies in ruins. But Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian commander, has drawn the Persians into a trap more subtle than Thermopylae's narrow pass. The Greek strategy depends on forcing a naval battle in the confined waters near Salamis, where Persian numerical superiority becomes a disadvantage. The Greek triremes, smaller and more maneuverable than their Persian counterparts, can exploit their superior seamanship and tactical coordination. The Battle of Salamis in September 480 BCE destroys Persian naval supremacy in a single day. Xerxes watches from a throne placed on a nearby hillside as his fleet, representing decades of preparation and the naval power of a dozen subject peoples, dissolves into chaos. Greek rams smash Persian hulls, Greek marines board enemy vessels, and Greek fireships spread destruction through the crowded Persian formation. The naval defeat forces a complete re-evaluation of Persian strategy. Without control of the sea, the massive army becomes a logistical nightmare rather than an asset. Supply lines back to Asia are now vulnerable to Greek raids. Worse, the defeat encourages rebellions throughout the empire as subject peoples begin to doubt Persian power. Xerxes makes the psychologically understandable but strategically disastrous decision to return to Asia with most of his forces, leaving his general Mardonius with a smaller army to continue the conquest. This effectively admits that the expedition has failed in its primary objective, demonstrating Persian invincibility to both enemies and subjects. Mardonius's campaign in 479 BCE represents the Persian Empire's last realistic chance to conquer mainland Greece. With a hand-picked force of about 50,000 troops, including the elite Persian immortals, he has the flexibility that the previous year's massive army lacked. His strategy is sophisticated. Use Persian gold to bribe Greek states into switching sides while defeating the remaining resistance in detail. The approach nearly succeeds. Many Greek states do switch sides, and the Greek alliance shows signs of fragmenting under the strain of prolonged warfare. But at Plataea in August 479 BCE, the combined Greek forces under Spartan leadership achieve a decisive victory that ends Persian hopes of European conquest forever. The battle reveals both the strengths and limitations of Persian military adaptation. Mardonius has learned from previous defeats, employing more flexible tactics and making better use of cavalry and archers. But he cannot overcome the fundamental mismatch between Persian imperial methods and Greek political culture. His Greek allies fight half-heartedly, knowing that Persian victory means the end of their independence. Meanwhile, the Greek resistance fighters with desperate courage, understanding that defeat means enslavement. Mardonius dies in the fighting, and his army retreats in disorder. On the same day, according to Greek accounts, a Greek fleet defeats the remaining Persian naval forces at Mycale, encouraging the Ionian Greeks to revolt once again. The great expedition that began with such magnificent preparations ends in complete failure. The psychological impact of the Persian defeats resonates far beyond Greece itself. Throughout the empire, subject peoples who had accepted Persian rule as inevitable begin to question whether resistance might be possible. The Egyptians revolt in 486 to 484 BCE, requiring a major military campaign to suppress. The Babylonians rebel in 482 to 481 BCE, prompting Xerxes to destroy the city's ancient temples and carry off the statue of Marduk. These harsh measures represent a fundamental shift in Persian imperial strategy. The tolerant, inclusive approach pioneered by Cyrus and refined by Darius gives way to more conventional methods of imperial control. The Persian Empire survives the Greek Wars, but it emerges as a different kind of state, more centralized, more repressive, and ultimately more fragile than the system it replaces. Xerxes' reign demonstrates that even the most sophisticated imperial system has limits. When those limits are reached, the choice becomes adaptation or rigidity. Unfortunately, for the long-term health of the Persian Empire, the trauma of the Greek defeats pushes Persian leadership toward the rigidity that will eventually prove fatal when confronted by an even more formidable opponent, Alexander the Great. Chapter 5. Decline and Court Intrigue, 465–336 BC. The assassination of Xerxes in 465 BCE marks more than the end of a reign. It signals the beginning of the Persian Empire's long, slow transformation from dynamic expansion to defensive consolidation. When Artaxerxes I takes the throne, he inherits an empire that is still the world's largest and wealthiest state, but one that has lost the innovative spirit that made Persian rule revolutionary. The next 130 years will see the empire survive multiple crises through military strength and diplomatic cunning, yet it will never again attempt the kind of systematic expansion that characterized its first century. The shift becomes apparent in how Persian kings handled the perpetual Greek problem. Rather than mounting another massive invasion, Artaxerxes adopts a policy of strategic interference, using Persian gold to fund whichever Greek city-states are fighting Athens, ensuring that Greek energy remains focused on internal conflicts rather than challenges to Persian rule. This approach proves remarkably effective. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, exhausts both Athens and Sparta, leaving both too weak to threaten Persian interests. But this defensive strategy reflects a deeper change in Persian imperial psychology, where Cyrus and Darius saw every challenge as an opportunity for growth and adaptation. Their successors increasingly viewed challenges as threats to be contained. The empire's administrative genius turns inward, focusing on preserving existing arrangements rather than creating new possibilities. The reign of Artaxerxes also witnesses the emergence of court intrigue as a major factor in Persian politics. The royal succession becomes increasingly uncertain as competing factions within the Persian nobility struggle for influence. The king's brother Ctesiphon rebels in Bactria. The satrap of Syria attempts to declare independence. Even successful suppression of these revolts requires resources that might otherwise support expansion or innovation. More troubling is the growing influence of court eunuchs and palace bureaucrats who gain power through proximity to the king rather than military or administrative achievement. These officials often lack the practical experience of governing diverse populations that characterized earlier Persian leadership. Their advice tends toward caution and precedent rather than the bold experimentation that built the empire. By the reign of Artaxerxes II, 404 to 358 BCE, the centrifugal forces within the empire have grown powerful enough to challenge central authority directly. The Great Satrap's Revolt, 372–362 BCE, sees virtually the entire western portion of the empire declare independence simultaneously. Ariobarzanes in Hellespont, Phrygia, Massalis in Caria, and Orontes in Armenia coordinate their resistance, creating the most serious internal threat the empire has faced since Darius I's accession crisis. What makes this revolt particularly dangerous is that it occurs during a period when the central government is distracted by a succession struggle between Artaxerxes II and his brother Cyrus the Younger. The Battle of Cunaxa, 401 BCE, sees a Persian king fighting for his throne against another Persian prince supported by 10,000 Greek mercenaries, a scenario that would have been unthinkable during the empire's early period when royal legitimacy seemed unquestionable. The employment of Greek mercenaries by both sides reveals another symptom of imperial decline. The Persian military system, once based on the willing service of subject peoples who saw Persian rule as beneficial, increasingly depends on hired soldiers with no loyalty beyond their pay. These mercenaries fight effectively, but they cannot provide the deep commitment to imperial survival that earlier Persian armies drew from their diverse ethnic composition. The satraps' revolts ultimately fail, but their suppression requires compromises that further weaken central authority. Rebellious satraps who submit, receive pardons, and retain their positions. Local autonomy increases as the central government lacks the administrative capacity to impose detailed control over distant provinces. The empire survives, but it becomes less centralized and less efficient with each crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the revolts demonstrate that Persian administrative innovations are no longer sufficient to maintain imperial unity. The satrap system, brilliant in its original conception, has evolved into a framework that enables resistance rather than preventing it. Regional governors have become powerful enough to challenge the king, but they remain too isolated from each other to create effective alternatives to imperial rule. During this period of internal focus, Persian leadership fails to recognize the emergence of a new threat on the empire's western frontier. Philip II of Macedon transforms his kingdom from a backwater state into the dominant power in northern Greece. But Persian attention remains fixed on managing existing problems rather than anticipating new ones. This represents a crucial failure of the intelligence and diplomatic systems that served earlier Persian kings so well. Cyrus and Darius had maintained extensive networks of informants and allies throughout the known world, enabling them to identify potential challenges before they became serious threats. Their successors allowed these systems to decay, focusing primarily on court politics and immediate administrative concerns. When Philip does appear on Persian radar, the initial response follows traditional patterns: attempt to bribe him, fund his enemies, and avoid direct confrontation. These methods might have worked against typical Greek city-states, but Philip has created something new, a unified Macedonian kingdom that combines Greek military innovation with non-Greek political centralization. The assassination of Philip in 336 BCE provides the Persian Empire with its best opportunity to prevent the crisis that will destroy it. His son Alexander is only 20 years old and faces immediate challenges to his authority throughout the Macedonian kingdom. A swift Persian intervention supporting Philip's rivals might have prevented Macedonian expansion entirely. Instead, Darius III dismisses the young Macedonian king as inexperienced and focuses on domestic concerns. This proves to be the most catastrophic intelligence failure in Persian history. While Persian courtiers debate palace intrigues and provincial tax assessments, Alexander spends 2 years consolidating his power, crushing Greek rebellions, and preparing for the invasion that will end Persian rule forever. The Persian response to early reports of Macedonian military preparations reveals how fundamentally the empire's strategic thinking has changed since its founding. Where Cyrus would have immediately gathered intelligence about Macedonian capabilities and sought to understand their motivations, Darius III relies on conventional wisdom about Greek warfare. Where Darius I would have attempted to divide the Macedonian coalition through diplomacy while preparing multiple military responses, Darius III simply assumes that traditional Persian advantages, vast resources, numerical superiority, and defensive geography will prove sufficient. This complacency reflects a deeper problem that has been growing throughout the 4th century BCE. The Persian Empire has become a victim of its own success, so accustomed to its advantages that it cannot imagine losing them. The administrative systems that once facilitated rapid adaptation to new challenges have become bureaucratic obstacles to innovation. The cultural tolerance that once won over conquered peoples has calcified into indifference toward external threats. Even more problematically, the empire's military has lost the technological and tactical edge that made Persian expansion possible. While Macedonian engineers develop new siege technologies and Macedonian commanders experiment with combined arms tactics, Persian military thinking remains focused on the mass infantry formations and cavalry charges that succeeded against earlier enemies. The Persian army is still formidable, but it's fighting the last war rather than preparing for the next one. The reign of Artaxerxes III, 358 to 338 BCE, demonstrates both the empire's remaining strengths and its fatal weaknesses. On the positive side, Artaxerxes successfully reconquers Egypt after 60 years of independence, proving that Persian military power remains impressive when properly focused. His generals employ innovative tactics, including the use of Greek mercenaries and siege engineers, showing that the empire retains some capacity for adaptation. But the Egyptian reconquest also reveals disturbing trends. The campaign requires unprecedented brutality, including the systematic destruction of Egyptian temples and the slaughter of sacred animals. This represents a complete abandonment of the tolerant policies that originally made Persian rule acceptable to diverse populations. The empire can still conquer, but it no longer knows how to rule. More ominously, the Egyptian campaign exhausts the royal treasury and requires heavy taxation throughout the empire. Subject peoples who once prospered under Persian rule now see it as an economic burden. The positive-sum relationship between conquerors and conquered that sustained Persian expansion has become a zero-sum struggle for resources. The assassination of Artaxerxes III by his minister Bagoas in 338 BCE, the same year as Philip's victory at Chaeronea, symbolizes the empire's internal decay. Court intrigue has become so pervasive that even successful kings cannot trust their closest advisors. The succession crisis that follows leaves the empire leaderless precisely when external threats are multiplying. Darius III's accession in 336 BCE comes too late to reverse these trends. He inherits an empire that is still vast and wealthy by any objective measure, but one that has lost the institutional flexibility and cultural confidence that made Persian rule sustainable. The administrative genius of Darius I has devolved into bureaucratic routine. The religious tolerance of Cyrus has become mere indifference. The military innovation of Cyrus and Cambyses has stagnated into conventional thinking. Most fatally, the empire has lost the ability to inspire loyalty among its subjects. Where once Persian rule seemed to offer prosperity and protection, it now appears to promise only taxation and conscription. The diverse peoples who once fought willingly for Persian kings now await opportunities to regain their independence. When Alexander arrives with promises of liberation rather than conquest, he will find audiences prepared to listen. The tragedy of this period lies not in any single catastrophic decision, but in the gradual abandonment of the principles that made Persian rule revolutionary. Each individual choice, to focus on court politics rather than external threats, to employ mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers, to extract resources rather than generate prosperity seems rational in isolation. Collectively, they transformed the world's most successful empire into a hollow giant waiting for someone strong enough to push it over. The Persian Empire of 336 BCE retains all the external trappings of greatness: magnificent palaces, vast armies, and submission from peoples across 3 continents. But it has lost the internal substance that made such greatness sustainable. The collision with Alexander will expose these weaknesses in the most dramatic possible way, but the real defeat occurs during the decades of gradual decay that make such a collision decisive. Chapter 6. Alexander's Conquest 336-323 BCE. In the spring of 334 BCE, a 22-year-old king led 35,000 Macedonian and Greek soldiers across Hellespont into Asia. To Persian observers, this invasion appears no different from previous Greek expeditions, ambitious but ultimately doomed raids that Persian gold and Persian steel have always turned back. Yet within 13 years, this young man will destroy an empire that has dominated the known world for over 2 centuries. The collision between Alexander of Macedon and the Persian Empire represents one of history's great moments of transformation, when an old order crumbles and a new one emerges from its ruins. The Persian response to Alexander's landing reveals how completely the empire's leadership misunderstands the threat they face. Arsaces, the satrap of Hellespont and Phrygia, organizes a conventional defense based on previous experience with Greek invasions. He assembles local Persian forces and Greek mercenaries at the Granicus River, intending to defeat the Macedonians before they can establish a foothold in Asia. This strategy has worked against earlier Greek expeditions, but Alexander isn't leading a typical Greek expedition. The Battle of the Granicus in May 334 BCE becomes a masterclass in combined arms tactics that the Persian military establishment fails to comprehend. Alexander coordinates his companion cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, Macedonian phalanx, and Thracian light troops with a precision that Persian commanders have never encountered. More importantly, he demonstrates a willingness to take personal risks that transforms his soldiers from hired fighters into devoted followers. When Alexander leads the cavalry charge that breaks the Persian line, he isn't simply employing sound tactics, he is modeling a type of leadership that the Persian system cannot match. Persian kings rule from golden thrones, surrounded by elaborate court ceremonies that emphasize their divine status. Alexander fights in the front ranks, sharing his soldiers' dangers and demonstrating that Macedonian leadership flows from personal courage rather than inherited authority. The Granicus victory opens western Anatolia to Macedonian conquest, but Alexander's treatment of conquered territories proves even more revolutionary than his military tactics. Instead of imposing Macedonian governors, he maintains existing administrative structures or replacing Persian appointees with local leaders who accept Macedonian sovereignty. Greek cities receive guarantees of autonomy. Non-Greek populations find their tax burdens reduced and their religious practices respected. This approach directly challenges the Persian model that has sustained imperial rule for 2 centuries, where Persian administration emphasizes the benefits of inclusion in a vast, diverse empire. Alexander offers something more appealing: the combination of local autonomy with protection by the world's most successful military. He is not trying to replace the Persian Empire with a Macedonian version. He is trying to transcend the imperial model entirely. The news of Granicus finally penetrates the Persian court's complacency, forcing Darius III to confront the reality that this invasion threatens not just another frontier province, but the empire's survival. The great king's response reveals both his personal courage and his strategic limitations. Rather than allowing subordinates to handle what he still hopes is a localized crisis, Darius decides to take personal command of the imperial army and crush the Macedonian threat through overwhelming force. The army that Darius assembles for the Battle of Issus in November 333 BCE represents the last flowering of Persian military might. Contingents arrive from across the empire: immortals from Persia proper, Scythian cavalry from the steppes, war elephants from India, Greek mercenaries from the western satrapies. This isn't merely a military force. It's a display of imperial diversity, demonstrating that peoples from 3 continents still answer the great king's summons. Yet this diversity, once a source of Persian strength, has become a tactical liability. The different contingents fight according to their traditional methods, making coordination difficult and unified command nearly impossible. Persian tactics depend on each ethnic group contributing its specialized capabilities to a combined effort. But Alexander's innovations have made such approaches obsolete. The battle itself unfolds as a collision between two completely different military philosophies. Darius positions his forces defensively, intending to let Alexander's army exhaust itself against superior numbers and then counterattack with fresh reserves. This represents traditional Persian strategy: use imperial resources to outlast enemies who lack such advantages. Alexander employs the tactical flexibility that has made Macedonian armies unbeatable. He refuses to attack where Darius expects, instead using his cavalry to exploit gaps in the Persian line, while his infantry engages enemy attention elsewhere. When the Persian formation begins to buckle, Alexander leads a direct assault on Darius's position, forcing the great king to choose between personal survival and military honor. Darius's flight from Issus becomes one of history's most consequential moments. His physical courage is not in question. He fights until Persian resistance collapses around him. But his decision to preserve his life rather than die with his army undermines the fundamental principle of Persian kingship, that the great king embodies the empire as divine mandate and cannot be defeated by mortal enemies. The capture of Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children, provides Alexander with both a propaganda victory and a diplomatic opportunity. His respectful treatment of the Persian royal family demonstrates that Macedonian conquest need not mean Persian humiliation. More subtly, it suggests that Alexander sees himself not as the destroyer of Persian civilization, but as its potential successor. Alexander's advance into Mesopotamia in 331 BCE forces Darius to make a final stand at Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh. This battle will determine not just the fate of the Persian Empire, but the future of the entire ancient world. Darius has spent 2 years preparing for this confrontation, assembling an army that represents the empire's maximum military effort. The Persian preparation for Gaugamela shows both the empire's remaining strengths and its fatal weaknesses. Darius commands perhaps 100,000 troops, including the finest cavalry and infantry units from across his domains. Persian engineers have prepared the battlefield, creating favorable terrain for chariot attacks and cavalry maneuvers. The great king has even recruited Scythian allies from beyond the empire's northern frontiers, demonstrating that Persian diplomacy can still achieve impressive results. But the army's composition reveals the empire's deteriorating relationship with its subject peoples. Many contingents consist of conscripted troops with little enthusiasm for fighting Macedonians who promise liberation from Persian taxation. The Greek mercenaries, once the empire's most reliable soldiers, have become unreliable as Alexander offers better terms for defection. Most tellingly, several satrapies have simply ignored the royal summons, calculating that Persian victory is unlikely and Macedonian revenge certain. The Battle of Gaugamela on October 1, 331 BCE becomes the decisive encounter that Persian leaders have sought since Alexander's invasion began. For the first time, the Macedonians faced the full might of the Persian Empire under ideal conditions chosen by Persian commanders. If Persian military methods can succeed anywhere, they should succeed here. The battle's outcome destroys not just the Persian army, but the credibility of Persian resistance. Alexander's tactical innovations prove superior even when Persian forces enjoy every advantage. The Macedonian phalanx advances inexorably through Persian infantry formations. The companion cavalry breaks Persian mounted units that have dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries. Most devastatingly, Alexander's personal leadership inspires his troops to extraordinary efforts, while Darius' remote command style fails to coordinate effective resistance. When Darius flees the battlefield again, his remaining supporters begin to calculate whether continued resistance serves their interests. The message is unmistakable. If the great king cannot protect himself, how can he protect his subjects? The psychological foundations of Persian imperial authority collapse along with Persian military power. Alexander's entry into Babylon, Susa, and finally, Persepolis represents more than military occupation. It marks his transformation from foreign conqueror to Persian successor. His treatment of these cities reveals a sophisticated understanding of imperial psychology that Persian leaders have lost during their decades of internal focus. In Babylon, Alexander presents himself as the legitimate heir to Mesopotamian kingship, offering sacrifices to Marduk and maintaining traditional administrative structures. In Susa, he distributes captured Persian treasures to his soldiers while ensuring that Persian nobles who submit receive positions in the new administration. These actions demonstrate that Macedonian conquest offers continuity rather than destruction. The burning of Persepolis initially seems to contradict this conciliatory approach, but Alexander's motivations prove more complex than simple revenge. The destruction occurs during a drunken celebration that Alexander later regrets, suggesting that even he struggles with the psychological challenges of replacing rather than merely defeating Persian authority. More significantly, Alexander's subsequent behavior shows that he views Persepolis' destruction as a symbolic end to Persian resistance rather than Persian civilization. He begins adopting Persian court ceremonial, marrying Persian noblewomen, and integrating Persian administrators into his government. The message becomes clear. Alexander intends to rule not as a Macedonian king who happens to control Persian territory, but as a universal monarch who synthesizes the best elements of both traditions. This synthesis alienates some Macedonian followers who expected to benefit from Persian defeat rather than witness Persian incorporation into a new imperial system. The plots against Alexander that emerge during his final years often originate from Macedonians who feel betrayed by their king as Persian sympathies. Ironically, Alexander's greatest challenge comes not from Persian resistance, but from his own people's unwillingness to transcend the ethnic divisions that he seeks to overcome. The Persian Empire's collapse under Alexander's assault results from a combination of military innovation, political sophistication, and institutional decay that makes effective resistance impossible. But Alexander's conquest also represents something unprecedented: the attempt to create a truly universal monarchy that transcends the cultural limitations of previous imperial systems. When Alexander dies in Babylon in 323 BCE, he leaves behind not just a conquered Persian empire, but a new model for organizing human societies that will influence political development for centuries to come. Chapter 7. The Seleucid Inheritors, 323 to 141 BCE. When Alexander dies in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, June 323 BCE, the vast territories he conquered face an immediate crisis of succession. His empire stretches from Macedonia to India, encompassing dozens of distinct cultures and millions of people who have accepted Macedonian rule only because of Alexander's personal authority. Without his unifying presence, this artificial construction threatens to dissolve into chaos, reverting to the independent kingdoms and tribal territories that existed before his conquests. The struggle among Alexander's generals, the Diadochi for control of his inheritance, reshapes the ancient world over the next 4 decades. By 281 BCE, 3 major kingdoms emerge from this conflict: the Achaemenids in Macedonia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and most significantly for Persian history, the Seleucids controlling the vast Asian territories from Anatolia to the Indus River. Seleucus I Nicator, the founder of this dynasty, faces the enormous challenge of governing the former Persian heartland with a tiny Greek and Macedonian minority ruling over millions of Persian, Mesopotamian, Syrian, and Central Asian subjects. The Seleucid solution to this challenge reveals both the possibilities and limitations of Hellenistic imperialism. Unlike the Ptolemies, who can rely on Egypt's natural geographical unity and ancient administrative traditions, or the Achaemenids, who rule a relatively homogeneous Greek population, the Seleucids must create new systems for governing Alexander's most diverse territories. Their approach combines Macedonian military organization, Greek urban planning, and Persian administrative practices into a synthesis that preserves the empire's unity while adapting to local conditions. Seleucus I establishes a network of Greek cities throughout his domains, creating islands of Hellenic culture in the vast Asian interior. Antioch in Syria becomes the kingdom's western capital, while Seleucia on the Tigris in Mesopotamia serves as the administrative center for the eastern provinces. These cities aren't merely military garrisons. They redesigned as cultural and economic hubs to demonstrate the benefits of Greek civilization while providing local populations with opportunities for advancement through adoption of Hellenic customs. But the Seleucid system's genius lies in its flexibility regarding local traditions. Persian nobles who accept the new regime find positions in the royal administration. Zoroastrian fire temples continue to operate alongside Greek gymnasia. Babylonian commercial law remains in force alongside Greek political institutions. This isn't the cultural tolerance of the original Persian Empire, which respected diversity as a matter of principle, but rather a pragmatic recognition that effective rule requires accommodation of existing systems. The Seleucid Empire's greatest challenge emerges not from Greek cultural resistance or Persian nostalgia, but from the vast distances that separate its various territories. The eastern provinces, Bactria, Sogdiana, and the Iranian Plateau, lie weeks of travel from the western capitals, where Seleucid kings maintain their courts. This geographical reality forces provincial governors to exercise considerable autonomy, creating conditions that eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation. The process begins during the reign of Antiochus II, 261 to 246 BCE, when Diodotus, the Greek governor of Bactria, declares independence and establishes the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This isn't a rejection of Hellenistic culture. Diodotus and his successors continued to consider themselves inheritors of Alexander's legacy. Rather, it represents a practical recognition that effective governance requires local rather than distant authority. The Greco-Bactrian independence movement succeeds because it offers local populations the best elements of both Greek and Persian traditions. The new kingdom maintains the urban culture and military organization that made Alexander's conquests possible, while respecting the agricultural and commercial systems that make the region prosperous. Bactrian Greeks even expand their territory into northern India, creating Indo-Greek kingdoms that blend Hellenistic and Buddhist influences in unprecedented ways. Simultaneously, an even more significant challenge emerges from the northwest when the Parthians, an Iranian people related to the Scythians, begin expanding from their strongholds in the Caspian region. Led by Xerxes I, the Parthians represent something new in the post-Alexander world, a people who combine Persian administrative traditions with nomadic military tactics, creating a synthesis that proves remarkably effective against Hellenistic armies. The Parthian expansion reveals a fundamental weakness in Seleucid strategy. While the kingdom excels at governing settled populations through its network of Greek cities and Persian administrators, it struggles against nomadic peoples who can avoid decisive battles while constantly raiding settled territories. The Seleucid response, mounting large expeditions to crush Parthian resistance, proves counterproductive, as these campaigns drain royal resources while failing to achieve lasting results. The reign of Antiochus III, 222 to 187 BCE, represents the Seleucid Empire's final attempt to restore the territorial unity that Alexander created. Known to history as Antiochus the Great, he possesses both the ambition and the capabilities necessary for such an undertaking. His eastern expedition, 212 to 205 BCE, temporarily re-establishes Seleucid authority as far as the Indus River, forcing both the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms to acknowledge his suzerainty. The Eastern expedition showcases the Seleucid military at its most effective. Antiochus combines traditional Macedonian phalanx formations with Persian cavalry, Central Asian horse archers, and even Indian war elephants into a cosmopolitan army that can adapt to diverse tactical challenges. His diplomatic skills prove equally impressive as he negotiates treaties that preserve local autonomy while re-establishing imperial unity. But Antiochus's greatest achievement also reveals the empire's insurmountable limitations. The Eastern expedition succeeds because it offers local rulers partnership rather than subordination, essentially acknowledging that direct Seleucid control over such vast territories is impossible. The empire survives by transforming itself from a centralized kingdom into a loose confederation of allied states, a structure that works as long as the central authority remains strong, but becomes vulnerable when that authority faces serious challenges. Those challenges emerge from an unexpected direction when Antiochus decides to expand westward into Greece and Anatolia, bringing him into conflict with the rising power of Rome. The Roman-Seleucid War 1921-88 BCE ends in decisive defeat at the Battle of Magnesia, forcing Antiochus to abandon his western territories and pay massive indemnities that cripple the royal treasury. The Roman victory has consequences far beyond the immediate territorial losses. The Seleucid defeat encouraged rebellions throughout the empire as local rulers calculate that royal authority is no longer sufficient to protect them. More fundamentally, the war demonstrates that the Hellenistic world has reached its limits. Further expansion must now contend with powers that possess military and organizational capabilities equal to those that made Alexander's conquests possible. The weakening of Seleucid power creates opportunities that the Parthians exploit with remarkable skill. Under Mithridates I, 171 to 138 BCE, the Parthian Empire expands rapidly westward, conquering Hyrcania, Mesopotamia, and eventually Babylonia itself. By 141 BCE, Parthian forces capture Seleucia on the Tigris, effectively ending meaningful Seleucid presence in the Iranian world. The Parthian success represents more than simple military conquest. It marks the revival of Persian imperial traditions under new leadership. The Parthians adopt the title King of Kings, claim descent from the Achaemenids, and present themselves as liberators freeing Iranian peoples from foreign Greek rule. This appeal to Persian legitimacy proves remarkably effective among populations who have never fully accepted Hellenistic authority. Yet the Parthians also demonstrate considerable sophistication in adapting useful elements from their Seleucid predecessors. They maintain Greek cities as centers of commerce and culture. They employ Greek administrative techniques, where these prove superior to traditional Iranian methods. They even continue to use Greek as a diplomatic language in their western territories. The result is a synthesis that combines the best aspects of Persian, Greek, and nomadic traditions. The Parthian military system proves particularly innovative. Unlike the Seleucids, who depend primarily on heavy infantry formations inherited from Alexander's army, the Parthians emphasize mounted warfare that exploits the mobility advantages of their nomadic heritage. The famous Parthian shot firing arrows while retreating becomes a tactical innovation that frustrates Roman legions for centuries. More importantly, the Parthian political system solves the central problem that destroyed the Seleucid Empire: how to maintain unity across vast distances with limited communications. Rather than attempting direct control from distant capitals, the Parthians create a feudal system where local nobles govern their territories as autonomous vassals of the King of Kings. This approach sacrifices administrative efficiency for political stability, but it proves remarkably durable. The Seleucid collapse in the Iranian world marks the end of the most ambitious experiment in cultural synthesis that the ancient world ever attempted. For nearly 2 centuries, Greek kings tried to govern Persian territories through a combination of Hellenistic innovation and Persian tradition. Their ultimate failure results not from any single catastrophic decision, but from the inherent tensions between Greek political culture and the realities of governing vast, diverse populations. The Hellenistic approach works brilliantly in regions where Greek cities can serve as focal points for cultural and economic development. But it struggles in areas where nomadic or semi-nomadic populations resist urbanization. And it breaks down entirely when faced with peoples who can offer equally attractive alternatives to Greek rule. The Parthian victory also demonstrates the continuing vitality of Persian political traditions. Despite centuries of foreign rule, first Macedonian, then Seleucid, the Iranian peoples retain their distinctive approaches to governance, military organization, and cultural development. When opportunity arises, they successfully reassert their independence and create new imperial systems that draw on their ancient heritage while adapting to changed circumstances. The transformation from Seleucid to Parthian rule represents more than a change of dynasty. It marks the beginning of a new phase in Persian history, where indigenous Iranian traditions reassert themselves after centuries of foreign influence. The Parthians will face their own challenges, particularly from an expanding Roman Empire, but they succeed in re-establishing Persian control over the Iranian world and creating the foundation for the even more impressive Sasanian Empire that will follow. The legacy of Seleucid rule in Iran proves complex and enduring. While the dynasty ultimately fails to maintain political control, its cultural influences persist in art, architecture, urban planning, and administrative practices. The synthesis of Greek and Persian traditions that the Seleucids attempted continues to influence Iranian civilization throughout the Parthian period and beyond, demonstrating that even failed political experiments can generate lasting cultural achievements. Chapter 8. The Parthian Empire, 247 BCE to 224 CE. In the windswept steppes south of the Caspian Sea, around 247 BCE, a tribal leader named Xerxes makes a decision that will reshape the ancient world. The Parni, a nomadic Iranian people related to the Scythians, have lived for centuries as raiders and herders on the margins of settled civilization. But Xerxes sees an opportunity in the growing weakness of Seleucid control over eastern Iran, and transforms his followers from tribal nomads into the founders of an empire that will challenge Rome for supremacy over the ancient Near East. The Parthian rise to power represents something unprecedented in ancient history: the successful transformation of a nomadic society into a sophisticated imperial state without losing the military advantages that nomadic life provides. Unlike previous conquests where settled peoples defeated nomads through superior organization, or nomads conquered settled peoples only to be absorbed by their victims' cultures, the Parthians create a synthesis that combines the best elements of both ways of life. The early Parthian strategy reveals remarkable political sophistication. Rather than simply raiding Seleucid territories and withdrawing with plunder, Xerxes and his successors systematically establish control over the trade routes that connect Central Asia with Mesopotamia. They position themselves as protectors rather than predators, offering merchants security in exchange for tribute and gradually building the economic foundation necessary for imperial expansion. This approach succeeds because it addresses a real need in the post-Alexander world. The Seleucid Empire's decline has left a power vacuum in the Iranian heartland, creating opportunities for local strongmen and foreign raiders to disrupt the commercial networks that sustain urban civilization. The Parthians fill this vacuum by providing the security that trade requires while respecting the local customs and religious practices that the Seleucids have increasingly neglected. The transformation becomes evident during the reign of Mithridates I, 171 to 138 BCE, when Parthian expansion accelerates dramatically. The conquest of Media brings the Parthians into contact with the sophisticated administrative traditions of the former Persian Empire. Rather than imposing their own simple tribal structures, they adopt and adapt Persian governmental methods, creating a hybrid system that combines nomadic flexibility with imperial efficiency. The Parthian solution to the fundamental problem of governing vast territories with limited communication represents one of the ancient world's great political innovations. Instead of attempting to rule through centralized bureaucracy like the Persians or through networks of Greek cities like the Seleucids, the Parthians create a feudal system that grants considerable autonomy to local rulers while maintaining overarching imperial unity. The system works through a hierarchy of kings subordinate to the king of kings. Major regions like Armenia, Adiabene, and Sharatani are governed by rulers who maintain their own armies, collect their own taxes, and govern according to local customs, but who acknowledge Parthian supremacy and provide military service when required. This arrangement satisfies local desires for autonomy while giving the Parthian monarch access to military resources from across the empire. The Parthian nobility, the great feudal families like the Suran, Karen, and Miran, provide the system's backbone. These families combine vast landed wealth with military traditions that enable them to field private armies capable of independent operations. Unlike Roman senators or Persian satraps, who depend on imperial appointment for their authority, Parthian nobles possess hereditary power bases that make them partners rather than subordinates of the King of Kings. This decentralized approach proves remarkably resilient when tested by external pressures. When Roman armies invade Mesopotamia, local Parthian nobles can organize resistance without waiting for orders from distant capitals. When succession disputes arise, regional power centers can maintain stability while the central government resolves its conflicts. The system sacrifices administrative efficiency for political durability. But in a world of slow communications and external threats, durability proves more valuable than efficiency. The Parthian military reflects this political decentralization. Rather than maintaining standing armies like Rome or Persia, the Parthians rely on feudal levies that combine professional heavy cavalry with tribal horse archers. This system produces forces ideally suited to the vast open spaces of the Iranian plateau while remaining flexible enough to adapt to different tactical challenges. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE provides the most famous demonstration of Parthian military capabilities and reveals why their tactical innovations proved so effective against conventional ancient armies. When Marcus Licinius Crassus leads 7 Roman legions into Mesopotamia, he expects to face enemies similar to the Gallic or Germanic tribes that Roman forces have defeated elsewhere. Instead, he encounters a completely different form of warfare that exploits every weakness in Roman tactical doctrine. The Parthian army at Carrhae consists of only 10,000 men, 1,000 heavy cavalry, cataphracts, and 9,000 horse archers, compared to Crassus's 40,000 legionnaires and auxiliaries. By conventional ancient standards, the Romans should win easily through superior numbers and disciplined infantry tactics. But Serena, the young Parthian general commanding the expedition, employs innovations that render Roman advantages irrelevant. The horse archers begin the battle by surrounding the Roman formation and subjecting it to continuous arrow fire from just beyond javelin range. When Roman troops attempt to charge, the Parthians retreat while continuing to shoot backward. The famous Parthian shot that becomes synonymous with tactical withdrawal. When the Romans form defensive squares, the arrows find targets in the packed formations. When they extend their lines to reduce arrow effectiveness, the cataphracts charge through the gaps. Most devastatingly, Serena has solved the traditional limitation of nomadic warfare, the inability to sustain long engagements due to limited ammunition. A train of camels carrying additional arrows enables the horse archers to maintain their bombardment throughout the day. The Romans find themselves trapped in a tactical situation where their traditional advantages become liabilities and their enemy, as supposed weaknesses prove to be strengths. The destruction of Crassus' army sends shockwaves throughout the Roman world and establishes the Parthians as the only power capable of defeating Roman legions in open battle. More importantly, It demonstrates that the tactical innovations developed on the Central Asian steppes can be adapted to challenge the military systems that have dominated Mediterranean warfare since Alexander's time. The Parthian-Roman conflict that begins with Carrhae evolves into something unprecedented in ancient history. A centuries-long struggle between roughly equal powers that neither can decisively defeat. Unlike Rome's previous enemies, who either submit to Roman expansion or are destroyed by it, the Parthians possess the resources and strategic depth necessary to survive temporary defeats while inflicting permanent damage on their opponents. The geographic factor proves crucial to this balance. The Syrian-Mesopotamian frontier becomes a permanent war zone where both empires maintain fortified positions and client states, but neither can achieve lasting conquest. Roman armies can capture Parthian cities during favorable campaigns, but they cannot hold them against inevitable counterattacks. Parthian forces can raid Roman territories and destroy Roman armies, but they cannot threaten the Mediterranean heartland that provides Rome's ultimate strength. This strategic stalemate forces both empires to develop sophisticated diplomatic policies regarding the numerous small kingdoms and tribal confederations that control territory between the major powers. Armenia becomes the classic example of this proxy warfare, changing hands repeatedly as Roman and Parthian influence waxes and wanes. The kingdom's rulers learn to play both sides, accepting subsidies and protection from whichever empire seems stronger, while maintaining enough independence to switch sides when circumstances change. The Parthian approach to client management reveals considerable diplomatic skill. Rather than demanding direct incorporation like Rome, the Parthians offer attractive terms to local rulers. Maintain your traditional authority, keep your religious and cultural practices, govern according to your ancient laws, but acknowledge Parthian supremacy and provide military assistance when required. This arrangement proves particularly appealing to peoples who value their independence but need protection from stronger neighbors. The Roman response adapts slowly to Parthian methods. Early emperors attempt to solve the Parthian problem through decisive military campaigns that will force a conventional peace treaty. But experience gradually teaches Roman leaders that the Parthians cannot be defeated through traditional means. Later emperors develop more sophisticated approaches that combine military pressure with diplomatic incentives, attempting to split the Parthian confederation by offering attractive terms to individual nobles and client rulers. The reign of Vologases IV, 147 to 191 CE, illustrates both the empire's continuing capabilities and its growing limitations. Vologases successfully resists major Roman offensives under Marcus Aurelius and maintains Parthian influence in Armenia and Mesopotamia. He also sponsors architectural projects and cultural developments that demonstrate the empire's prosperity and sophistication. Yet his long reign also witnesses the progressive weakening of central authority as regional nobles become increasingly autonomous. The succession crisis following Vologases IV's death exposes the fundamental contradictions in the Parthian system. Multiple claimants emerge, each supported by different combinations of noble families and regional power centers. Unlike earlier succession disputes, which were typically resolved through military confrontation and negotiation among the great families, this crisis drags on for decades without clear resolution. The empire effectively fragments into competing kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy while lacking the power to impose unity. During this period of internal chaos, the Sasanian family in Fars steadily builds its power base by appealing to Persian religious and cultural traditions that the Parthians have never fully embraced. Papak, the Sasanian patriarch, presents himself as a defender of Zoroastrian orthodoxy against the religious syncretism that characterizes Parthian rule. His son Ardashir develops these themes into a comprehensive ideology that challenges not just Parthian political authority, but the entire philosophical foundation of Parthian rule. The Sasanian message proves particularly appealing to Persian priests and nobles who feel marginalized by the Parthian system's emphasis on feudal relationships over religious authority. Where the Parthians treat Zoroastrianism as one religion among many worthy of respect, the Sasanians proclaim it as the one true faith that should guide imperial policy. Where the Parthians accept cultural diversity as a practical necessity, the Sasanians advocate Persian cultural supremacy as a divine mandate. The Battle of Hormizd in 224 CE brings the Parthian Empire's history to a dramatic close. When Ardashir I challenges the last Arsacid king, Artabanus IV, to single combat during the battle, he is not merely employing a dramatic gesture, he's making a symbolic statement about the nature of legitimate authority. The duel represents a confrontation between two completely different concepts of kingship: the Parthian model based on feudal consensus and the Sasanian model based on divine appointment. Artabanus's death in this combat eliminates not just a rival claimant, but the last effective representative of the Parthian system. The great noble families who have sustained Arsacid rule for nearly 5 centuries now face a choice between supporting a discredited dynasty or accommodating themselves to Sasanian authority. Most choose accommodation, calculating that Sasanian rule offers better prospects for maintaining their local power than continued resistance. The Parthian collapse occurs with surprising rapidity once the political center fails. Regions that have maintained nominal loyalty to the Arsacids for generations quickly declare for Ardashir when it becomes clear that effective Parthian resistance is impossible. The feudal system that has provided the empire's strength becomes a liability when the great families decide that their interests lie with the new dynasty rather than the old. Yet the Parthian legacy proves more durable than the Parthian state. The administrative methods, military techniques, and diplomatic practices that the Parthians develop continue to influence their Sasanian successors. The feudal relationships that the Parthians establish between the central government and regional elites persist under new management. Even the Parthian approach to client state management continues to shape Sasanian foreign policy. The Parthian achievement represents something unique in ancient history: the successful transformation of a nomadic confederation into a sophisticated imperial state without losing the military advantages that nomadic origins provide. For nearly 5 centuries, the Parthians demonstrate that the mobility and tactical flexibility of steppe warfare can be combined with the administrative sophistication and economic resources of settled civilization. This synthesis influences military development throughout the ancient world. Roman tactical doctrine evolves in response to Parthian innovations, placing new emphasis on cavalry and missile weapons. Chinese military theorists study Parthian methods for defending against nomadic invasions. The Sasanians inherit and further develop Parthian approaches to mobile warfare that will later influence Islamic military practices. Perhaps more significantly, the Parthian political model provides an alternative to the centralized bureaucracies that characterize most ancient empires. The feudal system that the Parthians developed proves remarkably adaptable to diverse geographic and cultural conditions. This flexibility enables the empire to govern territories ranging from the Syrian desert to the Central Asian steppes while accommodating populations with radically different economic and social systems. The Parthian approach to cultural diversity also establishes precedents that influence later imperial development. Unlike the Romans, who attempt to assimilate subject peoples into a common imperial culture, or the Chinese, who view cultural uniformity as essential to political stability, the Parthians demonstrate that imperial unity can coexist with cultural autonomy. This lesson proves particularly relevant for later Islamic empires that must govern diverse populations across vast territories. The Parthian Empire's ultimate failure results not from external conquest or internal rebellion, but from the inherent tensions between feudal decentralization and imperial coordination. The system that enables the empire to survive external pressures and adapt to changing Circumstances also creates opportunities for fragmentation when central authority weakens. The great families who provide the empire's strength become its destroyers when they decide that their interests no longer align with imperial unity. The transition from Parthian to Sasanian rule marks more than a dynastic change. It represents the triumph of a more centralized, religiously orthodox, and culturally unified approach to imperial governance. The Sasanians will prove more successful than the Parthians at creating institutional structures capable of surviving political crises, but they will never match the Parthian ability to adapt to diverse circumstances while maintaining imperial cohesion. The Persian world gains stability under Sasanian rule, but it loses the flexibility that made Parthian rule so remarkably durable for so many centuries. Chapter 9. The Sasanian Empire in 224 CE. When Artaxerxes I stands over the body of the last Parthian king at Hormistigan, he claims more than a battlefield victory. He announces the restoration of Persian greatness after 5 centuries of foreign and quasi-foreign rule. The Sasanian dynasty that Artaxerxes founds will create the last and arguably greatest of the Persian empires, a civilization so magnificent and powerful that it rivals Rome itself and establishes cultural and administrative patterns that will influence the Islamic world for centuries to come. The Sasanian revolution represents far more than a simple change of dynasty. Where the Parthians had created a loose feudal confederation that accommodated diverse traditions and local autonomies, the Sasanians envision a centralized empire unified by Persian culture and Zoroastrian religion. Artaxerxes doesn't merely claim the title King of Kings. He revives the entire ideological framework of Achaemenid legitimacy, presenting himself as the rightful heir to Cyrus and Darius, chosen by Ahura Mazda to restore order to the world. This ideological transformation proves remarkably effective because it addresses real weaknesses in the Parthian system. The feudal structure that enabled Parthian survival through centuries of Roman pressure had also created chronic political instability as great families pursued conflicting interests. The religious diversity that made Parthian rule acceptable to different populations had also prevented the development of shared imperial identity. The cultural tolerance that facilitated local autonomy had also inhibited the creation of unified administrative standards. Artaxerxes' solution synthesizes the best elements of Persian tradition with innovations designed to address these problems. He retains the Parthian administrative division of the empire into regions governed by appointed officials, but he centralizes authority by making these appointments dependent on royal favor rather than hereditary right. He maintains the Parthian emphasis on heavy cavalry and mobile warfare, but he creates professional military units directly loyal to the crown rather than to regional nobles. Most importantly, Artaxerxes establishes Zoroastrianism as the empire's official religion while creating institutional structures that make religious orthodoxy a requirement for political advancement. This doesn't represent crude religious intolerance. Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and other minority communities continue to practice their faiths throughout Sasanian territories. Rather, it creates a shared ideological framework that unifies the Persian elite while distinguishing them from their subjects. The reign of Shapur I, 240 to 270 CE, marks the Sasanian Empire's emergence as Rome's equal in power and sophistication. The son of Artaxerxes inherits his father's vision of Persian restoration, but possesses the military genius necessary to implement it on a global scale. Under Shapur, the Sasanian Empire expands to its greatest territorial extent while developing the administrative and cultural institutions that will sustain it for 4 centuries. Shapur's western campaigns against Rome demonstrate the effectiveness of Sasanian military reforms. The traditional Persian emphasis on cavalry warfare, refined through centuries of Parthian innovation, proves devastatingly effective against Roman infantry formations when properly coordinated with siege warfare and diplomatic pressure. The capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE represents not just a military triumph, but a symbolic demonstration that the Persian Empire has reclaimed its position as a great power. The famous rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustem, showing Valerian kneeling before the victorious Persian king, serve as propaganda masterpieces that communicate Sasanian messages to both Persian and foreign audiences. To Persians, the reliefs demonstrate that their new dynasty has restored the empire's ancient glory. To Romans and other foreign observers, they announce that the Persian Empire demands respect as an equal power. To subject peoples throughout the empire, they suggest that Persian authority enjoys divine sanction and earthly success. But Shapar's achievements extend far beyond military conquest. His administrative reforms create the institutional framework that enables the Sasanian Empire to function as a unified state rather than a loose confederation. The establishment of 4 great regions, Khorasan in the northeast, Nimros in the southeast, Kerbaran in the southwest, and Azerbaijan in the northwest, provides clear hierarchical structure while maintaining administrative flexibility. Each region has its own appointed governor who reports directly to the king, but these officials can adapt imperial policies to local conditions. The cultural synthesis that Shapar achieves proves equally impressive. The king personally patronizes scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan court culture that rivals anything in Rome or China. Persian artisans develop new techniques in metalwork, textiles, and architecture that influence artistic development from Europe to Central Asia. Zoroastrian theologians engage in sophisticated philosophical debates that refine religious doctrine while accommodating diverse intellectual traditions. The 4th and 5th centuries CE witness an unprecedented situation in ancient international relations. Coexistence of 2 roughly equal superpowers who are capable of inflicting serious damage on each other, but incapable of achieving decisive victory. The Roman-Persian conflicts of this period differ fundamentally from earlier imperial wars because both sides possess the resources, organizational capabilities, and strategic depth necessary to survive temporary defeats while continuing long-term resistance. The reign of Shapar II, 309 to 379 CE, illustrates the complexity of this relationship. Known as the Great for his military achievements, Shapar spends most of his 70-year reign in conflict with Rome. Yet the frontier between the empires remains essentially unchanged despite massive expenditures of blood and treasure by both sides. The Persian king proves capable of defeating Roman armies and capturing Roman cities, but he cannot translate these tactical successes into strategic advantages that would enable permanent conquest of Roman territory. This strategic stalemate forces both empires to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to warfare and diplomacy. Perhaps most significantly, both empires begin to understand that their conflict represents something unprecedented in ancient warfare: struggle between civilizations rather than simply between states. The religious dimension becomes increasingly important as Christianity spreads throughout the Roman Empire, while Zoroastrianism consolidates its dominance in Persia. These religious differences provide ideological justification for continued warfare while making permanent peace politically difficult for rulers on both sides. The Treaty of 387 CE, which partitions Armenia between the two empires, represents the closest either side comes to accepting the other's permanent existence. Yet even this agreement reflects exhaustion rather than genuine resolution, and conflicts resume whenever either empire perceives opportunities for advantage. The Roman-Persian relationship becomes a permanent feature of late antique international relations, requiring both sides to maintain expensive military establishments and defensive fortifications that drain resources needed for internal development. The 5th and 6th centuries CE represent the pinnacle of Sasanian cultural achievement, a period when Persian civilization develops distinctive forms of expression in art, literature, architecture, and learning that influenced cultural development across Asia and beyond. The empire's prosperity during this period reflects not just military success and administrative efficiency, but the creation of economic and intellectual conditions that enable creative flourishing on an unprecedented scale. The Sasanian court becomes a magnet for scholars, artists, and intellectuals from throughout the known world. Greek philosophical texts are translated into Persian and Syriac, preserving classical learning that would otherwise be lost. Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge spreads westward through Persian cultural networks. Chinese technological innovations reach the Mediterranean world through Persian intermediaries. The empire serves as a crucial bridge between the great civilizations of antiquity. Persian literature during this period develops themes and forms that will later influence Islamic literary culture. The epic traditions that celebrate Persian heroic history stories of Rustam, Esfandiar, and other legendary figures are refined and codified into narrative cycles that establish the foundation for later masterworks like Ferdowsi, Shahnameh. These epics do not merely entertain. They create a shared cultural identity that unifies diverse populations under Persian rule while distinguishing Persian civilization from both Roman and nomadic alternatives. Sasanian architecture achieves a distinctive synthesis that combines Persian structural innovations with decorative traditions drawn from throughout the empire. The great palace complexes at Ctesiphon and Persepolis showcase engineering techniques that enable the construction of massive unsupported spaces. The Great Arch at Ctesiphon spans over 25 meters without intermediate supports. These architectural achievements reflect not just aesthetic preferences, but the empire's ability to mobilize enormous resources for projects that demonstrate royal power and cultural sophistication. The religious synthesis that the Sasanians achieve proves particularly significant for later developments. While maintaining Zoroastrianism as the official imperial cult, they create institutional structures that accommodate diverse religious communities while preventing any single group from challenging royal authority. Christian communities flourish in Mesopotamia and Armenia. Jewish populations prosper in Babylonia, creating some of the most important religious texts in Jewish history. Buddhist influences remain strong in eastern regions. This religious pluralism within an officially orthodox framework provides a model that later Islamic empires will adapt to their own circumstances. The reign of Khosrow I and Nushirvan, 531 to 579 CE, represents the Sasanian Empire at its absolute zenith, a period when Persian power, prosperity, and cultural achievement reach levels that will never again be equaled by any native Iranian dynasty. Known to his Persian subjects as the Just and to his enemies as the Great, Khosrow combines military genius with administrative innovation and intellectual sophistication in ways that establish him as one of history's great rulers. Khosrow's domestic reforms transformed the Sasanian Empire into the ancient world's most efficiently governed state. His tax system, based on careful surveys of agricultural productivity and commercial activity, generates unprecedented revenues while maintaining the empire's economic vitality. His administrative reforms create clear hierarchical structures that ensure imperial policies are implemented consistently across vast territories while preventing the regional autonomy that had plagued earlier Persian empires. The military reforms that Khosrow implements prove equally revolutionary. He creates the first truly professional army in Persian history, with standardized training, equipment, and command structures that enable coordinated operations on multiple fronts. The famous Iranian cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry units, reached their highest development under his patronage, becoming the model for heavy cavalry formations throughout the medieval world. But perhaps Khosrow's greatest achievement lies in his creation of a court culture that attracts the finest minds of his age. When Justinian closes the philosophical schools in Athens in 529 CE, Many Greek scholars find refuge at the Persian court, where they continue their intellectual work under royal patronage. The famous Academy of Gandhishapur becomes a center of learning that preserves and develops Greek, Persian, and Indian intellectual traditions during a period when much of this knowledge is being lost in the West. The economic prosperity that the empire enjoys under Khosrow's rule reflects not just good administration, but the development of trade networks that span the known world. Persian merchants established trading posts from Constantinople to Canton, creating commercial relationships that generate enormous wealth for the imperial treasury. The famous Silk Road reaches its greatest development during this period, with Persian territories serving as the crucial link between East Asian and Mediterranean economies. The empire's very success under Khosrow I creates the conditions for its eventual destruction. The prosperity and administrative efficiency that characterize his reign enable his successors to mount increasingly ambitious campaigns against both Rome and the nomadic peoples beyond the empire's northern frontiers. But these military adventures gradually exhaust the resources that Khosrow had so carefully accumulated while failing to achieve the decisive victories that would justify their enormous costs. The Byzantine-Persian wars of the early 7th century represent the final flowering of the ancient rivalry between Rome and Persia. But they also demonstrate that both empires have reached the limits of their expansion capabilities. When Khosrow II, 590 to 628 CE, conquers Egypt, Syria, and much of Anatolia, he achieves the greatest Persian military success since Darius I. Yet these conquests prove impossible to hold when the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launches his counteroffensive, and by 628 CE, Persian forces have been driven back to their starting positions. The mutual exhaustion that results from these wars leaves both empires vulnerable to external threats that neither had previously considered serious. The Sasanian Empire has survived centuries of conflict with Rome by maintaining its internal strength and unity. But the succession crisis following Khosrow II's assassination creates exactly the kind of political instability that effective external defense requires avoiding. More ominously, the religious and cultural changes occurring throughout the empire during this period begin to undermine the ideological foundations of Sasanian rule. The spread of Christianity, particularly among the empire's Aramaic-speaking populations, creates communities whose ultimate loyalty lies with religious rather than political authorities. The persistence of local identities among Arab, Armenian, and other ethnic groups provides potential bases for resistance when imperial authority weakens. The economic strain of constant warfare also begins to erode the prosperity that has sustained Sasanian power. The tax burden necessary to maintain large armies and extensive fortifications becomes increasingly difficult for agricultural and commercial populations to bear. The trade routes that have generated much of the empire's wealth become targets for raiders rather than sources of revenue as political stability deteriorates. By 630 CE, the Sasanian Empire remains formidable in purely military terms. Its armies are still the best equipped and most professional forces in the ancient world. But the political, economic, and ideological foundations of its power have been severely weakened by decades of overextension and internal conflict. When a new threat emerges from the Arabian Peninsula, the empire will discover that its apparent strength conceals fundamental vulnerabilities that make effective resistance impossible. Chapter 10. The Islamic Conquest. In the scorching summer of 636 CE, two armies face each other across the dusty plains near the Euphrates River at Ctesiphon. On one side stands the military might of the Sasanian Empire, Rustam Farrukhzad commanding battle-hardened Persian cataphracts, war elephants from India, and the elite immortals who have dominated Middle Eastern battlefields for centuries. On the other side, a force of Arab warriors led by Sayyid ibn Abi Waqqas carries weapons that seem almost primitive by comparison: simple swords, spears, and an unshakable faith in their divine mission to spread Islam throughout the world. To Persian observers, this confrontation must seem like countless others they have faced and won. Arabian tribes have raided the empire's borders for generations, occasionally requiring military expeditions to restore order, but never posing a serious threat to imperial survival. The Sasanians have recently emerged victorious from their exhausting wars with Byzantium. Their administrative system remains intact, their cities prosperous, their armies professional. How could these desert nomads possibly challenge the most sophisticated empire in the ancient world? The answer lies not in military technology or numerical superiority, but in the revolutionary transformation that Islam has wrought among the Arabian tribes. The religious unity that Muhammad achieved among peoples who had spent centuries fighting each other has created something unprecedented. A confederation of warrior believers whose commitment to their cause transcends tribal loyalties and personal interests. These aren't raiders seeking plunder. They're missionaries carrying a message they believe comes directly from God. The Battle of Ctesiphon unfolds over 4 days of increasingly desperate fighting that reveals both the strengths and limitations of Sasanian military doctrine. The Persian war elephants initially panic Arab horses and disrupt Muslim formations, but the Arabs adapt quickly, targeting the elephant's eyes and using special tactics to neutralize this advantage. The famous Persian heavy cavalry proves less effective against enemies who refuse to stand still for traditional charging attacks. More significantly, the battle demonstrates the psychological transformation that Islam has achieved among its Arab followers. When Rostam Farrukhzad dies in the fighting, some accounts say struck down while trying to rally his troops, others killed while attempting to flee. Persian resistance collapses despite retaining numerical superiority. The death of a commander typically signals the end of ancient battles, but the Muslim forces continue fighting with undiminished intensity because their loyalty extends beyond personal relationships to religious conviction. The victory at Ctesiphon opens the road to Ctesiphon, the magnificent capital that has served as the seat of Persian power for 4 centuries. When Muslim forces approach the city in 637 CE, they encounter something that epitomizes both the grandeur and the vulnerability of late Sasanian civilization. The Great Palace Complex, with its soaring arch and priceless treasures, represents architectural and artistic achievement that dwarfs anything in the Arabian Peninsula. Yet the city's population offers little resistance to the approaching conquerors. This apparent contradiction reflects the complex relationship between the Sasanian state and its subjects that has developed over centuries of imperial rule. While the empire's elite Persian nobles, Zoroastrian priests, and royal administrators remain deeply committed to the existing system, large portions of the population have become alienated from Sasanian authority through decades of heavy taxation and religious discrimination. Christian communities, in particular, often view the Muslim conquerors as potential liberators from Zoroastrian Orthodox oppression. The Muslim treatment of conquered territories reveals sophisticated understanding of imperial psychology that rivals anything in Persian tradition. Rather than imposing immediate cultural or religious change, the Arab commanders offer attractive terms to local populations. Maintain your religious practices, keep your traditional leaders, continue your economic activities, but accept Muslim political authority and pay specified tributes. This approach directly challenges the Persian model of imperial legitimacy by demonstrating that effective governance doesn't require cultural or religious uniformity. The capture of the royal treasury at Ctesiphon provides the material foundation for continued Muslim expansion while simultaneously demonstrating the exhaustion of Sasanian resources. The enormous wealth accumulated over centuries of Persian rule gold, silver, precious stones, silk tapestries, and artistic treasures, beyond counting, falls into Muslim hands, providing funding for additional military campaigns, while symbolizing the transfer of imperial authority from Persia to the emerging Islamic state. Perhaps most significantly, the fall of Ctesiphon forces the last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, to abandon the empire's administrative center and seek refuge in the eastern provinces. This decision effectively acknowledges that the western portions of the empire Mesopotamia, the economic heartland that has sustained Persian power since Cyrus, can no longer be defended. The empire that once stretched from Central Asia to the Euphrates has been reduced to its Iranian core in less than a decade. Yazdegerd III's flight to Isfahan and then to Merv represents more than tactical retreat. It marks the beginning of a desperate attempt to preserve Persian independence through the mobilization of resources and loyalties that the Arab conquest has not yet reached. The eastern provinces of Khorasan and Transoxiana remain largely untouched by Muslim forces, while local Persian nobles retain their military capabilities and administrative structures. If Persian resistance can be organized effectively, the empire might yet survive in reduced form. The challenge facing Yazdegerd reveals the fundamental weakness that has made Sasanian collapse possible. The centralized administrative system that enabled effective imperial governance during periods of stability becomes a liability when central authority is threatened. Unlike the earlier Parthian Federation, which could survive the destruction of any single power center, the Sasanian Empire depends on royal authority emanating from the capital. When that authority is displaced, regional nobles must choose between continued loyalty to a fugitive king or accommodation with successful conquerors. The Iranian response to this crisis varies significantly by region and social class. Persian nobles in Fars and Karman, the traditional heartland of Sasanian power, generally remain loyal to Yazdegerd and organize resistance to Muslim expansion. But nobles in peripheral regions often calculate that their interests lie with the new order rather than the old. Christian and Jewish communities throughout the empire increasingly see Muslim rule as preferable to Zoroastrian domination. Most importantly, the common people, farmers, artisans, and merchants care more about security and economic opportunity than political legitimacy. And the Muslims often provide both more effectively than Persian authorities. The Battle of Nihavand in 642 CE marks the last serious attempt by organized Persian forces to reverse Muslim conquests through conventional military action. Persian commanders assemble a substantial army that includes the remaining elite units of the Sasanian military, along with hastily recruited regional levies. The choice of Nihavand as the battle site reveals Persian strategic thinking. Control this mountain pass, and Muslim forces cannot easily advance into the Iranian plateau. The Persian defeat at Nihavand, so complete that Arab sources call it the conquest of conquests, results not from superior Muslim military technology, but from the same factors that determined earlier battles: superior morale and tactical flexibility. The Muslim forces fight with the confidence of previous victories and religious conviction, while Persian troops increasingly doubt their ability to reverse the string of defeats that has characterized the war. When the Persian line breaks, resistance collapses throughout western Iran as local commanders conclude that further fighting is hopeless. The assassination of Yazdegerd III near Merv in 651 CE brings the Sasanian Empire to an ignominious end and closes the final chapter of ancient Persian independence. The last king of kings dies not in heroic battle defending his capital, but as a fugitive murdered by his own subjects for the reward money that Muslim authorities have placed on his head. This sordid conclusion reflects the complete breakdown of the loyalty relationships that sustained Persian imperial authority for over a millennium. Yet the end of Sasanian political power does not mark the disappearance of Persian civilization. The administrative skills, cultural traditions, and intellectual achievements that the Persians have developed over centuries of imperial rule prove attractive to their Muslim conquerors, who gradually incorporate Persian methods into their own governmental systems. The Arabic phrase, "no royal court without Persian wisdom," reflects the continuing influence of Persian administrative traditions even after Persian political independence has ended. The conversion of Persia to Islam proceeds gradually and varies significantly by region and social class. The Zoroastrian priesthood, whose authority depends on the connection between religious orthodoxy and political power, loses influence rapidly as that connection dissolves. Persian nobles find that conversion to Islam opens opportunities for advancement within the expanding Muslim empire while allowing them to maintain their local authority. Common people often discover that Islamic law provides better protection for their rights than Sasanian legal traditions. This transformation process reveals both the flexibility of early Islamic civilization and the persistent strength of Persian cultural identity. Rather than simply replacing Persian traditions with Arabian ones, Islam in Iran develops distinctive characteristics that blend Islamic religious principles with Persian literary, artistic, and administrative practices. The result is neither purely Arabic nor purely Persian, but a synthesis that creates new possibilities for cultural and political development. The geographic extent of Muslim conquest also demonstrates the completeness of Sasanian collapse. Within 2 decades of Qadisiyah, Muslim forces have advanced beyond the traditional boundaries of the Persian Empire into Central Asia, Afghanistan, and the Indus Valley. These conquests succeed not just because of Muslim military capabilities, but because the destruction of Sasanian power has eliminated the political structures that previously organized resistance to external invasion. The Islamic conquest of Persia represents one of history's great moments of civilizational transformation, comparable to Alexander's destruction of the Achaemenid Empire or Rome's absorption of the Hellenistic kingdoms. But unlike those earlier conquests, which largely replaced existing systems with the conqueror's traditions, the Arab conquest of Persia evolves into a genuine synthesis that preserves and develops the best elements of both civilizations. The administrative expertise that the Persians have refined over centuries of imperial rule becomes essential to Muslim expansion beyond Arabia. The Arabs possessed the military and religious enthusiasm necessary for conquest, but they lacked the bureaucratic sophistication required to govern vast territories with diverse populations. Persian administrators who convert to Islam find themselves in high demand throughout the expanding Islamic world, carrying their governmental knowledge from Spain to India. Persian literary and artistic traditions prove equally influential in shaping Islamic civilization. The court culture that the Sasanians developed with its emphasis on royal magnificence, artistic patronage, and intellectual sophistication provides models that Muslim rulers adopt and adapt to their own circumstances. The Persian language itself becomes a vehicle for Islamic culture, eventually rivaling Arabic in importance for literature, philosophy, and administration throughout much of the Muslim world. Perhaps most significantly, the Persian experience of conversion demonstrates Islam's capacity for cultural synthesis that transcends its Arabian origins. The religion that emerges in Persia during the centuries following the conquest incorporates Persian mystical traditions, Persian literary forms, and Persian administrative practices while maintaining its fundamental Islamic character. This synthesis proves remarkably successful in spreading Islamic influence throughout Asia while enriching Islamic civilization with traditions that pure Arabian Islam could never have generated. The end of the Sasanian Empire thus represents not just the destruction of ancient Persia, but the beginning of Persia as transformation into something new, a Persian Islamic civilization that will eventually produce some of the greatest achievements in poetry, architecture, philosophy, and statecraft that the medieval world will witness. The political independence that Cyrus created, and that 28 successive dynasties maintained for over a millennium, has ended. But Persian civilization has found new forms of expression that will prove even more influential than the ancient empire as political and military achievements. As we reach the end of our epic journey through Persian history, we stand witness to one of the most remarkable stories of cultural continuity and adaptation in human civilization. From Cyrus's revolutionary vision of tolerant empire in 550 BCE to the Safavid restoration of Persian independence in 1501 CE, across more than 2,000 years of conquests, transformations, and renaissances, something essentially Persian has survived, adapted, and ultimately flourished. This continuity defies the normal patterns of ancient history, where civilizations typically rise, peak, and disappear into the archaeological record. Egypt's pharaonic tradition lasted for 3 millennia, but ended completely with the Roman conquest. Greece's classical civilization influenced the world, but never recovered its political independence after the Roman expansion. Rome itself dominated half the known world, but left only ruins and memories when it finally collapsed. Yet Persia, despite suffering more complete conquests than any of these civilizations, somehow managed to preserve and transmit its essential characteristics through invasion, occupation, and foreign rule. The secret of this persistence lies in the fundamental insight that Cyrus the Great achieved 25 centuries ago. True power comes not from imposing uniformity, but from creating unity within diversity. This principle, which enabled the Achaemenids to govern the ancient world's most diverse empire, also enabled Persian culture to survive when direct political control was lost. Persian administrative genius, Persian literary sophistication, Persian artistic innovation, and Persian spiritual insight proved so valuable that conquerors consistently chose to adopt rather than destroy them. The pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across the centuries. Alexander conquers the Persian Empire, but transforms himself into a Persian-style monarch. The Seleucids rule former Persian territories, but employ Persian governmental methods. The Parthians overthrow Hellenistic rule, but claim legitimacy through connection to Persian traditions. The Sasanians restore native rule while synthesizing Persian heritage with contemporary innovations. Even the Arab conquest, which seems to end Persian independence forever, ultimately leads to Persian cultural renaissance within the Islamic framework. The metaphor that best captures the Persian historical experience is that of an eternal flame, a source of light and warmth that continues to burn regardless of the storms that rage around it. Sometimes the flame burns brightly in magnificent palaces like Persepolis or Isfahan. Sometimes it retreats to humble locations during periods of political crisis. Sometimes it appears to be extinguished entirely when foreign powers impose their own systems. Yet somehow it always reignites, often in unexpected places and forms, continuing to provide illumination for human civilization. This flame represents something more precious than political power or military dominance. It embodies the accumulated wisdom of a people who learned very early in their history that sustainable greatness comes from serving rather than ruling, from including rather than excluding, from adapting rather than resisting. The Persian contribution to world civilization lies not in the territories they conquered or the monuments they built, but in the insights they developed about how human societies can organize themselves to promote both individual flourishing and collective achievement. As we face the challenges of an increasingly interconnected world, the Persian example reminds us that diversity represents a source of strength rather than a problem to be solved. The Persian genius for synthesis, for finding ways to combine different traditions into new forms that preserve the best elements of each, offers a model for contemporary efforts to create global institutions that respect local autonomy while promoting universal human development. The story of Persia ultimately transcends the history of any single nation or culture. It represents humanity's ongoing struggle to create forms of organization that enable people from different backgrounds to live together peacefully and productively. The Persian success in achieving this goal repeatedly across more than 2 millennia of changing circumstances suggests that such achievement is possible, but it requires the kind of wisdom, flexibility, and respect for human dignity that Persian civilization exemplified at its best. The eternal flame of Persian civilization continues to burn today, not in any single nation or political system, but in the enduring human commitment to creating societies that combine order with freedom, unity with diversity, and strength with justice. In this sense, we are all inheritors of the Persian legacy, beneficiaries of insights that emerged from the windswept plateaus of ancient Iran, but have enriched human civilization, wherever people have sought to build better communities for themselves and their children. The Persian Empire may have ended more than 13 centuries ago, but Persian civilization remains eternally contemporary, continuing source of inspiration and guidance for anyone seeking to understand how human societies can achieve greatness while remaining humane. In our own age of global challenges and opportunities, the Persian example reminds us that the highest form of power lies not in the ability to compel obedience, but in the capacity to inspire others to achieve their own excellence within a framework of mutual respect and shared purpose. This is the true legacy of the Persian Empire, not the memory of ancient conquests or vanished glories, but the living tradition of civilization that continues to illuminate the path toward human flourishing in all its magnificent diversity.